The ice outside the windows of my Hudson Valley estate was howling against the glass, but the coldest thing in this room wasn't the New York winter. It was the realization that the man I had loved and funded for 8 years was calmly packing a suitcase to leave me to die. If you are listening to this, you might wonder how a woman who built a multi-million-dollar portfolio could end up paralyzed, bedridden, and gasping for air. Why didn't she just fight back or call for help? The truth is simple. Julian had been poisoning me for months. Day after day, my husband would brew my evening tea, whispering sweet reassurances while secretly lacing it with a custom chemical designed to mimic rapid physical decline. In reality, the man sleeping beside me was systematically dismantling me under the gaze of his mother, Evelyn, and sister Chloe. Years ago, when we met, I made a romantic mistake. I was the heir to a massive private equity fortune. But terrified of being loved for my money, I hid my background, playing the role of an ordinary career woman. When Julian struggled in his early business ventures, I poured my trust funds into his company, handed him the CEO title, and stepped into the shadows. I wanted to protect his fragile ego, believing absolute devotion would buy me genuine loyalty. Instead, I built a golden cage and handed the key to a parasite. Down the hallway, laughter shattered the silence of my sick room. Evelyn and Chloe were debating which dresses to pack for a 90-day European tour, Paris, Rome, the Amalfi Coast. A luxury getaway funded entirely by my bank accounts, timed perfectly with what they believed would be my final days. Footsteps approached. Julian walked in looking sharp, his eyes completely vacant. "Julian," I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. "My medication. Please, hand me the vial from the vanity." Julian crossed his arms, letting out a sharp sigh of exhaustion. "Elena, you are a constant nuisance," he said, his tone dripping with cruelty. "Every 5 minutes it's medication. The doctor said your disease is incurable. You're just draining our resources. Mom, Chloe, and I have a flight to catch at JFK. We aren't canceling a 90-day European trip to babysit someone who won't get better. Fend for yourself." My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened my mouth to remind him whose capital built his career, but Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face twisted in contempt. "Stop playing the victim, Elena," Evelyn sneered. "Julian deserves a break. If you're hungry, order delivery. If you need water, figure it out. We're leaving." Chloe popped her head in behind her. "Don't be so dramatic, sis. We'll be gone for 3 months. Stop ruining the mood." They turned around, their laughter echoing down the hallway as they wheeled their luggage toward the front door. As the front door clicked shut momentarily, Julian re-entered my bedroom. I held onto a pathetic, flickering thread of hope that maybe his conscience as a husband would surface, and he would leave my specialized vials on the bedside table. Reality, however, is far more vicious. Julian walked straight to the vanity. My specialized, life-prolonging medication sat there in neat rows. Without a word, he swept his arm across the surface, sending every bottle crashing into the trash can. "Julian, what are you doing? Those are my life-saving drugs." Julian leaned down until his mouth was right beside my ear. "Stop acting, Elena. When you finally pass away while we're in Europe, I'll handle the estate, the company, and the inheritance." He ripped my laptop and smartphone off the nightstand. "Oh, and before I forget," Julian whispered with a chuckle, "I've changed the smart lock passcode, shut off the main water valve in the basement, and flipped the electrical breakers. Enjoy your final days in total darkness and freezing silence. No one is coming for you." He turned on his heel and slammed the bedroom door. I remember staring at that closed door and realizing I wasn't crying anymore. I was simply remembering every time I had mistaken control for love. A second later, the smart heating system died, and the lights vanished into pitch blackness. From the heavy front door, I heard the mechanical engage of the deadbolt. They had locked me inside a freezing tomb, waiting for me to starve and succumb to their poison. The house plunged into absolute darkness. But as the winter wind howled against the window panes, something inside me didn't break. The terror vanished, replaced by an incandescent rage. They thought they had buried me alive. They had no idea who they had just declared war on. When the front door deadbolt clicked shut and the smart heater died, the temperature in the master bedroom dropped rapidly. Silence rushed in, thick and suffocating. If you've ever wondered how long a human being can survive in a freezing room with a failing heart, the answer is not long. Within the first hour, my fingers went completely numb, and the poison Julian had been feeding me slowed my breathing into a blurry gray haze. For a brief moment, panic tried to swallow me whole, but the harsh reality of corporate warfare set in. I wasn't just a sick wife abandoned by a cruel husband. I was a strategist who had survived hostile takeovers on Wall Street. Panic doesn't save companies, and panic certainly wasn't going to save my life. Years ago, when I first started acquiring distressed assets and negotiating high-stakes mergers, my father taught me a golden rule. Never rely entirely on open channels. People lie, systems fail, and technology can be locked down. That exact paranoia was the only reason I had prepared for a day like this. With every ounce of willpower left in my paralyzed body, I slid sideways across the mattress, gritting my teeth until my fingers brushed against something cold and hard. A burner phone I had hidden years ago. My hands shook as I pressed the power button. I didn't call 911. Local emergency services could easily be intercepted or delayed by the smart security system Julian had locked down. Instead, I dialed a private, unlisted 12-digit direct line memorized since childhood. I hated making that call, because the last time my father warned me about Julian, I told him he simply didn't understand love. I had spent years defending the man who was now trying to kill me, because asking my father for help also meant admitting I had destroyed my own life with the man I chose. It rang twice before a deep, calm voice answered. "Vance." My father's voice cut through the receiver, steady and commanding. "Dad," I whispered, breaking into a ragged gasp. It's Elena." On the other end, the absolute silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. My father, Arthur Vance, founder of Vance Capital, didn't waste a second with panicked questions. In his world, execution mattered more than emotion. "Where are you?" my father asked, his tone shifting into the cold precision of a military commander. "Hudson Valley, estate. Julian locked me inside, cut the heat, poisoned my tea. They're in Europe. I'm dying, Dad." "Hang on," my father said, his voice dropping an octave. "Do not close your eyes, Elena. I'm coming." The call disconnected with a sharp click. Now, you might be asking how my father could mobilize a rescue operation so fast. The truth is, my father never stopped watching over me. He maintained a discreet security perimeter around my life, waiting for my explicit authorization to breach. Time dissolved into a blur of agonizing heartbeats. My chest felt tight, like a vice closing around my ribs. My eyes fluttered shut as darkness crept inward from the edges of my vision. My heart was preparing to take its final beat. Suddenly, the eerie silence of the night was shattered by a concussive roar outside. Boom! The reinforced, smart-locked front doors of the estate didn't just open. They were blown off their heavy steel hinges by a precise tactical breaching charge. Heavy combat boots hit the oak flooring with rapid precision. Before I could process the sound, blinding tactical flashlights cut through the pitch-black hallway, painting the walls with sweeping beams of white light. A team of elite private security operatives in tactical gear flooded into my room, securing the perimeter. Right behind them rushed a mobile ICU medical response team, pushing heavy life support machinery across the floor. An emergency physician rushed to my bedside, pressing oxygen masks over my face and tearing open an intravenous line filled with neutralizing antidotes. "We've got a pulse. Her blood pressure is plummeting. Start the cardiac stimulants now," a medic shouted over the hum of portable monitors. As cool, life-saving oxygen flooded into my lungs and the fog in my brain cleared, a familiar figure stepped through the ruined doorway. My father, with silver hair and eyes burning with an icy, protective fury, walked over to my bed. He gently placed his warm hand over my trembling fingers. "You're safe now, my girl," my father murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Nobody touches a Vance and gets away with it." As the medical team lifted my stretcher toward the waiting helicopter parked on the snow-covered lawn, I looked back at the dark, silent room. Julian thought he had buried me in a frozen tomb. Instead, he had just dug his own grave. When I woke up 3 days later, the sterile, white ceiling of a private recovery suite in an exclusive hospital replaced the dark, freezing gloom of the Hudson Valley estate. If you've ever looked death directly in the eye, you know it changes the chemistry of your soul. For the first 2 weeks, my body fought a brutal war against the neurotoxins lingering in my tissues. But thanks to experimental treatments funded by my family and administered by top specialists, the paralysis slowly receded. My parents never left my bedside. Day and night, my mother held my hand, while my father stood guard like a silent sentinel. Their unconditional love kept me anchored while my physical strength returned. Yet, as my body healed, something else happened inside me. The grief, the shock, and the bitter betrayal didn't break me. They hardened into something unbreakable. If you are listening to this, you might think healing means forgiving and moving on. For some people, maybe. But when someone systematically tries to murder you for your wealth, forgiveness isn't grace. It's an invitation to be slaughtered twice. The soft woman who believed love could cure greed died in that freezing bedroom. In her place stepped the true heir to Vance Capital. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a titan preparing to take back her empire. Lying there in the quiet room, a sudden memory flashed through my mind, vivid and painful. I remembered the night Julian proposed, slipping a modest silver ring onto my finger while swearing that we would build everything together from scratch. I remembered the tiny apartment where we ate instant noodles because we couldn't afford anything else. Back then, Julian looked at me like I was his entire future. I still don't know when that look disappeared. Believing every word, I later handed him control, signing over corporate shares and funding his dreams because I thought love meant complete, blind trust. I had handed the knife to the man who would eventually use it to cut my throat. By week 4, I was well enough to sit upright. That was when the real work began. My father brought in Marcus and a team of investigators. They didn't just look at what Julian had done the night he left. They dug into every contract and financial signature from the past 3 years. What they uncovered on my laptop made my blood run cold. Julian wasn't just an ungrateful husband. He was a calculated predator. Marcus slid a thick portfolio across my tray table, pointing to a series of signatures. "Look closely at these papers, Elena," Marcus said, his voice clipped and serious. 6 months ago, when you were heavily medicated in the ICU, Julian brought you a stack of routine forms. You signed them believing they were operational approvals. They weren't. I stared at the fine print. He had tricked me into signing away control while I was heavily medicated. He had legally engineered a corporate coup, betting that my sudden passing would lock the doors forever. He thought he was clever, I murmured, a cold smile touching my lips. He thought a dying woman wouldn't leave a paper trail. He didn't just try to steal your company, Elena, Marcus replied. He left a wide-open trail of breadcrumbs, and right now he is following every single one of them straight into a trap. This brings us to the masterstroke of our strategy. While Julian, Evelyn, and Chloe were living it up in Europe, they operated under a fatal delusion. They assumed that because I was out of the picture, the black cards linked to my holding accounts were an endless, unrestricted ATM. They thought those 90 days in Europe were a victory lap celebrating their newfound wealth. In reality, every single swipe of those credit cards was digging a deeper hole. We didn't block their cards immediately. We let them spend. We let them buy expensive things and arrogantly rack up over $1.2 million in unauthorized expenses over 90 days. Every cent they spent was recorded as concrete evidence of financial embezzlement and premeditated betrayal. By day 89, my legal team had finalized the asset freezes, locking down every single bank account Julian thought he was inheriting. Julian had spent 3 months believing he was the smartest man alive, waiting for word of my death. He had no idea that his 90-day European vacation wasn't a holiday at all. It was a slow-motion trap closing tightly around his neck. While my recovery room at the Upper East Side Hospital was filled with the steady hum of monitors, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic, my husband and his family were living in a completely different reality. If you could peer into a parallel universe, you would see Julian, his mother Evelyn, and his sister Chloe, treating the capitals of Europe like their personal playground. From the cobblestone streets of Paris to the historic avenues of Rome, they moved with the arrogant swagger of self-made billionaires. They booked luxury penthouse suites overlooking major city landmarks and rented high-end vehicles to cruise down the European coastline, completely unbothered by any concept of limits. Evelyn draped herself in designer wear, while Chloe bragged on social media about her newly acquired collection of luxury items. Whenever the concierge handed them the bill, Julian didn't even flinch, casually tossing down the black corporate credit card linked to my holding accounts, treating my hard-earned capital like an endless well of cash. They operated under a toxic delusion. They firmly believed that back in New York, I was either already dead or drawing my final breaths in that freezing estate. Almost every evening, their family group chat, which my legal team was quietly mirroring in real time, lit up with jubilant messages. Evelyn texted, "Give it another week, and the house will legally be ours." Chloe chimed in with photos of luxury gatherings, writing, "Time to pick out which guest rooms we want in the Tribeca penthouse once the probate lawyers finish." Julian sent voice notes to his mother, boasting about how easily he had manipulated me, mocking my illness, and calculating how quickly he could liquidate my equity holdings the moment the death certificate was signed. They were so drunk on entitlement, so completely consumed by greed, that they didn't notice the invisible walls closing in. They had already crossed the threshold of $1.2 million in unauthorized luxury expenditures over 90 days, assuming there would never be a reckoning. Then came a crisp Tuesday afternoon in Paris. The trio was inside a multi-level luxury boutique near the Place Vendôme, surrounded by marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and attentive sales associates. Chloe had just piled several expensive items onto the glass counter. Evelyn was relaxing nearby, discussing which private charter they should book for the weekend. Julian stepped forward with a smug grin, pulling the black card from his leather wallet and handing it to the cashier. "Put it all on this one," Julian said smoothly, expecting the pleasing chime of an approved transaction. The cashier slid the card into the terminal. A second passed, followed by a sharp, grating electronic buzz that cut through the quiet elegance of the room. The screen flashed a harsh warning red text. "Card declined. Global asset freeze / suspicion of financial fraud." The boutique went dead silent. The cashier looked up coldly, her professional smile vanishing entirely. "Sir, this account has been globally frozen. I'm going to have to retain this card." Julian's smug expression froze, the color draining instantly from his cheeks. Panic descended upon them like a physical weight, crushing their arrogant facade in a fraction of a second. Evelyn dropped her glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor and spraying liquid across her designer shoes. Chloe rushed over, her face turning pale as she checked her digital wallet on her phone. "Mom, my app is saying all our bank accounts have been locked. All of them. The balances are reading 0. Julian frantically pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped it twice against the glass counter before finally snatching it up. He dialed the corporate banking hotline, his voice cracking under sudden terror. "Hello? What do you mean my authorization has been revoked? What do you mean a freeze order was issued from New York? That's impossible. My wife is—" Julian choked on his own words, the phone trembling against his ear. Elena must be dead. If she was dead, why did every account suddenly belong to someone else? The terrifying realization hit him like a physical blow, cutting off his breath. The line went dead with a soft click. Around them, the boutique sales associates stepped back, exchanging cold, judgmental glances. The security guards near the entrance shifted their weight, locking eyes on the trio. In seconds, the illusion shattered completely. The self-proclaimed billionaires holding the keys to an empire were suddenly stranded thousands of miles from home, with blocked cards, empty accounts, and no cash to pay for their rooms. They weren't masters of the universe anymore. They were just scared, broke strangers standing in the middle of Paris, realizing too late that the web they spun had trapped them. 90 days. That was the exact lifespan of their European fantasy. If you've ever wanted to witness the exact moment a group of arrogant grifters realizes they've walked straight into a cage, let me paint you a picture of a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. The calendar had finally ticked over to day 90. Back in New York, the weather was biting, but Julian, Evelyn, and Chloe stepped out of their town car outside my Tribeca penthouse with the warm tans of people who thought they had inherited the earth. They carried custom luggage stuffed with the millions in luxury goods they had charged to my accounts, laughing quietly among themselves. According to their grand timeline, today was supposed to be my memorial service, a somber display of grief where Julian would shed a few well-rehearsed tears, receive condolences from society elites, and officially take over the keys to the empire. Julian stepped up to the elevator landing, whistling softly, and punched the digital access code into the smart lock keypad. Beep. Error. Access permanently revoked. Before Evelyn could complain, the heavy double doors swung wide open from the inside, pulled back by my father's security detail. Julian, Evelyn, and Chloe stumbled forward into the foyer, their jaws dropping. The penthouse hadn't been prepped for a grieving widower. It had been transformed into a silent courtroom, and right there in the center of the grand living room, sitting in a high-backed leather armchair, was me. I wasn't in mourning black. I was wearing a sharp, tailored ivory pantsuit that commanded the entire room. My hair was pulled back into a sleek knot, and my eyes, cold, steady, and razor-sharp, locked directly onto them. For a terrifying second, none of them could move. Evelyn clutched her handbag, her face turning pale. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, taking 2 steps backward as if staring at a ghost. Julian's face cycled through shades of white. He forced a weak, trembling smile. Elena? My God. You're alive? You thought I was rotting in a frozen bedroom in the Hudson Valley. I finished for him, my voice cutting through the silent room like ice. You thought you could poison my tea, lock the doors, and inherit a multi-billion-dollar empire without a single obstacle? Before Julian could scramble for a lie, I stood up from my chair and walked slowly toward the glass coffee table. I didn't shout. In finance, shouting is a sign of weakness. Power speaks in a whisper. Drop the act, Julian, I said, sweeping my gaze across them. The performance is over. I dropped a folder at his feet. Every receipt was inside. Every lie had a number attached to it. $1.2 million, I said coldly, letting the numbers hang. That's how much you spent across Europe over 90 days. My forensic team tracked every swipe. Evelyn's eyes widened in terror. That was our money. I was legally poisoned by your son. I cut her off instantly, my voice hardening. And speaking of evidence, let's talk about what happened 90 days ago in my bedroom. With a flick of my wrist, the large smart television on the wall flickered to life. Security footage from my estate began to play on loop, showing Julian pouring the neuroinhibitor into my evening tea, and Evelyn and Chloe coordinating the digital lockout. The room filled with the horrifying sound of their own past voices echoing back at them. I didn't enjoy watching them panic. I only realized how completely I had stopped loving him. The strange thing was, I didn't hate him anymore. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. The veneer of confidence vanished completely. Panic broke through in an instant. Julian dropped hard to his knees on the marble floor. Elena, please, Julian sobbed, lunging forward. It was Evelyn. She planned the whole thing. She made me do it. Evelyn's jaw dropped. You ungrateful, spineless coward, Evelyn screeched, grabbing a handful of his hair. You are the one who poured the poison. Don't you dare put this on me. As mother and son scrambled and clawed at each other, Chloe stood frozen in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. I looked down at them with absolute detached pity. Save your breath for the federal prosecutors, I said, my voice echoing coldly. Federal grand larceny, wire fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. The warrants were signed this morning. Heavy footsteps echoed from the foyer as federal marshals and local police officers stepped into the penthouse, their badges gleaming under the lights. As Julian was hauled up from the floor in handcuffs, sobbing while Evelyn screamed curses into the air, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the skyline of New York City, watching the snow fall gently against the glass. They thought they had buried me. Instead, they had just dug their own graves. Welcome back to reality. The performance is over. If stepping back into my penthouse felt like reclaiming my throne, what happened 48 hours later at the corporate headquarters of Vance Capital was the final, unyielding execution of justice. The emergency board meeting had been called before dawn, cutting through the crisp morning air with absolute urgency. When I walked down the private glass-walled corridor into the executive boardroom, every single senior director, board member, and seasoned shareholder rose to their feet in absolute reverent silence. It was a powerful reminder of the deep respect and unwavering loyalty they had always held for my family name and our legacy. No one whispered. No one dared to look away. Julian was already seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by defense counsel who looked entirely out of their depth and visibly sweating under the harsh lighting. He had been hauled straight from the holding cells just long enough to face the music, wearing the same clothes he had on when federal marshals cuffed him. His face was a sickly gray, his hair completely disheveled, and his expensive designer suit hopelessly wrinkled from his night on a concrete jail bench. The contrast between the man who once strutted through these halls like a king and the broken prisoner sitting before me was absolute. I didn't waste a single second exchanging hollow pleasantries or showing fake empathy. I took my rightful seat at the head of the table, calmly opened my leather-bound file, and let my voice ring out across the silent room, crisp, measured, and entirely emotionless. As the majority shareholder and chair of this board, I announced, locking my gaze directly into Julian's hollow, panic-stricken eyes, I hereby formally strip Julian Hayes of his title as Chief Executive Officer of Vance Capital, effective immediately. All corporate authorities, signature rights, management access, and executive privileges are permanently and irrevocably revoked. Julian half rose from his chair, stammering frantically, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "Elena, you can't do this to me. We're married. We built this together. You can't just throw away everything we share." "Not for much longer," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his desperation like a blade before sliding a thick legal document across the polished table. "Alongside your criminal indictments for attempted murder, wire fraud, and grand larceny, I have just filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against you for commercial fraud, corporate sabotage, and gross breach of fiduciary trust. Your access to every single corporate asset is gone forever." Before I left the executive floor, I paused by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking down at the bustling Manhattan traffic below. A sudden memory flashed through my mind of the early days when I first brought Julian into this company, back when I thought building a life together meant sharing every single victory side by side, supporting each other through every challenge without keeping score. I spent years building his confidence while quietly dismantling my own. I remembered every boardroom meeting where I pretended he had made the final executive decision, letting him take the applause while I did the heavy lifting behind the scenes. I thought protecting his fragile pride was just another way of loving him. I thought shielding him from failure was the ultimate sacrifice of a devoted wife. I was wrong. So completely wrong. The truth hit me with absolute clarity, washing away every lingering trace of doubt or hesitation. For years, I had shrunk myself down to make room for a man whose ambitions were fueled entirely by entitlement and deception. I had worn myself thin, trying to support someone who viewed my boundless generosity not as a gift, but as an open invitation to exploit. Every concession I made was just another brick in the prison they built around me. Never again would I hide my strength to feed another person's ego. The soft, forgiving woman who sacrificed her own light to keep a fragile man warm was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never be fooled again, a woman who owned her empire and would protect it with an iron fist. I turned away from the glass, leaving the reflection of the city behind me, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back once. Behind me, the heavy oak doors clicked shut with a definitive sound, sealing away the final remnants of a chapter I had already outgrown. If the freezing streets of Queens were the beginning of their permanent downfall, the New York State Supreme Court in Manhattan was where the final, definitive chapter of justice was written. The historic, wood-paneled courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, filled from the front benches to the back rows with investigative journalists, legal analysts, and financial market observers eager to witness the ultimate fall of the empire. When I walked through the heavy oak doors and took my seat in the front row, wrapped in a quiet, composed dignity, every single eye in the gallery turned toward me. The tension in the room was so thick you could practically cut it with a knife, heavy with the weight of months of anticipation. Across the aisle, seated behind the defense table, was Julian. Gone was the expensive custom designer suit, the arrogant smirk, and the swagger of a self-made CEO who thought he owned the world. He wore a coarse, bright orange prison jumpsuit, his hair unwashed, his shoulders slumped forward, and his eyes hollow, bloodshot, and frantic. Beside him sat Evelyn and Chloe, both wearing matching gray detainee scrubs, their heads bowed low in sheer humiliation as they finally faced the cold, inescapable reality of what they had done. The trial didn't drag on for months or years, draining everyone's energy. In the face of undeniable, airtight proof, it was a swift, crushing demolition of their entire defense strategy. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The crystal clear security footage of Julian pouring the neuroinhibitor into my evening tea matched perfectly with the forensic medical reports and financial wire transfers, laid out a calculated, cold-blooded scheme to murder me for financial gain. Evelyn and Chloe weren't just innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The family group chat transcripts and digital access logs proved how they coordinated the smart home lockdown to ensure I would freeze to death, sealing their collective fate. The gallery fell into a breathless hush as the presiding judge adjusted his glasses, looked down from the elevated mahogany bench, and fixed his gaze directly upon Julian Hayes. Julian Hayes, the judge's voice echoed sternly through the cavernous courtroom, demanding total attention. You have been found guilty on all counts of premeditated attempted murder, grand larceny, wire fraud, and international conspiracy. Your actions displayed a chilling lack of human conscience and a profound abuse of trust. Julian clutched the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning stark white, his breathing coming in shallow, panicked gasps as reality crashed down upon him. For the crime of attempted murder and associated financial felonies, the judge continued, his tone unwavering and resolute, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay full restitution amounting to $5 million. The gavel came down with a sharp, resounding crack. The sound echoed off the high marble ceilings, signaling the absolute end of the line. Julian slumped forward into his hands, letting out a choked, broken sob. Evelyn buried her face in her arms, weeping uncontrollably as the federal marshals stepped forward, their heavy keys rattling against their belts. I expected victory to feel joyful. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. I had imagined this moment for months, dreaming of the day they would finally face the consequences of their greed. But revenge never gives you back the years you already lost. As the marshals led Julian, Evelyn, and Chloe away in handcuffs, disappearing through the heavy back doors of the courthouse, I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I walked out past the flashing cameras of the press corps into the crisp, clean air of Manhattan. The nightmare was finally over. The empire was safe, my soul was healed, and justice had been served down to the very last drop. Standing there on the steps of the courthouse, feeling the cool breeze brush against my face, I took a deep breath of absolute freedom. The long winter of betrayal had finally melted away, and the rest of my life was waiting for me, entirely unburdened by the past. Stepping back outside into the bright, warm sunlight of a Manhattan spring felt like breaking through a thick, suffocating layer of winter ice into open, boundless air. The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan Supreme Court swung shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud, and for the first time in months, the air tasted completely clean. I didn't walk out alone to face the flashing cameras and the roaring crowd. Waiting on the grand marble steps were my parents, my core security team, and the loyal executives who had stood by Vance Capital through every single storm. They didn't offer empty corporate platitudes or hollow sympathy. They offered steady hands, proud smiles, and the quiet comfort of people who knew what true loyalty, survival, and resilience truly meant in this harsh and unforgiving world. As my security detail cleared a smooth, unobstructed path toward the curb, a sudden, pathetic commotion broke out near the heavy police barricades. There, shivering and deeply disheveled behind the metal fence, stood Julian, Evelyn, and Chloe. They had been brought out briefly on temporary holds pending their immediate transfer to federal facilities, and their desperate eyes locked onto mine with a sickening, pleading hunger. Evelyn raised a trembling, manicured hand, as if to beg for mercy from the woman she had tried to destroy, while Chloe let out a sharp, ugly sob, realizing at last that the corporate empire they tried to steal was forever locked away from their reach. I paused for just a fraction of a second in the open air. I looked closely at the three of them, the man who had poured poison into my morning tea, the mother-in-law who had plotted behind my back in the shadows, and the sister-in-law who had locked me out in the freezing snow to die. I didn't feel a single flicker of rage. I didn't feel hatred, and I certainly didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I simply looked right through them, as if they were nothing more than empty ghosts of a life I had already completely outgrown. Without breaking my stride or offering a single wasted word, I turned my head away and stepped cleanly past them, leaving their hollow cries buried beneath the background noise of the bustling city traffic. My father stepped forward and opened the heavy door of a sleek, black luxury SUV waiting quietly at the curb. I slipped inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin, sliding across the plush leather seat. The heavy door clicked shut with a soft, satisfying seal, completely cutting off the distant police sirens, the flashing camera bulbs, and the desperate, weeping cries of the past. As the driver smoothly shifted gears and the SUV glided forward into the golden afternoon traffic, I leaned my head back against the seat, breathed in deeply, and closed my eyes in total serenity. Later that evening, back inside the absolute silence of my private penthouse apartment, the city lights twinkled far below, like distant stars. The heavy winter storm that had plagued my recovery months ago felt like a lifetime away. I walked quietly into the kitchen, turned on the electric kettle, and stood waiting as the water began to hum and heat up. I took out a clean porcelain cup and dropped a loose leaf of herbal tea inside. When the water boiled, I poured it slowly, watching the amber liquid swirl and steep, filling the air with a soft, soothing aroma. I stood by the kitchen counter for a very long time, staring down at the warm ceramic cup, watching the gentle wisps of steam rise into the cool evening air. I finally realized tea no longer frightened me. I took the first sip slowly. Months earlier, that same simple ritual almost became the last moment of my life. Now, it was just another quiet evening. It tasted exactly like tea. Not fear, not betrayal, just tea. For the first time in months, my hands didn't shake. A soft, hesitant knock sounded at the apartment door, breaking the stillness of the room. I turned around to see my father standing in the doorway, looking at me with a steady, protective gaze in his eyes. His expression softened by years of deep care. "Want me to stay tonight?" my father asked softly, lingering near the entrance. I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of lightness settle deep into my chest, realizing for the first time that I was no longer a victim trapped in someone else's trap. I was whole, safe, and completely in control of my own life. No, I smiled, shaking my head gently and holding the warm cup in my hands. I think I'm finally going to be okay. I watched the lights of Manhattan through the window. For years I thought success meant building an empire. That night, it simply meant being able to sleep without fear. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.